Continuing on in 4.4, let's write out a couple of equations showing everything that we just learned with our sinusoidal functions. That's another name to say our sine and our cosine functions here. So if we were given that information of the amplitude being the absolute value of A, the period being 2 pi over B, the phase shift being negative C over B, and the vertical shift being D, one thing that we can do is if we're given an equation, can we state all of the things that they're asking us for there? Can we find the amplitude, period, phase, shift of this first equation? Notice that they didn't ask for a vertical shift here because I don't see anything added or subtracted, so that's not part of this question. But if they're going to ask me for the amplitude, I know that the amplitude is the absolute value of the A value. So here, our amplitude is 3. The period is 2 pi over B, B being the value in front of the variable, and that gives us 2 pi over 2, or in other words, pi radians for our period. You could also write that as 180 degrees if you wanted. And then our phase shift, remember our phase shift is negative C over B, and that's going to give us negative 5 halves for our phase shift, meaning that this function is moving to the left 5 halves of a unit. Example 2, same story, even if it's the cosine function, so whether it's the sine or the cosine, we're still picking out all of those pieces. So here, if we're going to state the amplitude, looks like our amplitude is going to be 2. Our period is 2 pi divided by 3. Our phase shift is positive 4/3. We're going to be going to the right 4/3. And then our vertical shift is going to be up 8 based on adding the 8 there. Again, this is the same for the sine and the cosine function. Remember that if you had a tangent function, the period of the tangent is pi, so you would see a pi instead of a 2 pi in this location in the period. Remember that if this is a tangent function, the tangent has no amplitude no matter which number that you have out front. So if they give me an equation, I can pick out the amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift. The other thing that I can do is if they give me all of the information for the amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift, then I can go ahead and write an equation that's going to model that. So in example 3, they tell us that our amplitude is 7. Now this says to write a cosine function. We could also write a sine function. It just depends on what they tell us here. So in this case, they're asking for a cosine. If the amplitude is 7, what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, this was supposed to start with a cosine function, so it's the cosine of something. That means we're going to put a 7 out front. And what you'll see in your textbook answer key as you go through some of the questions is that they're going to put a plus or minus out front because the amplitude is the absolute value of the number out front. That means that could be a positive 7 or it could be a negative 7. Okay, so the amplitude's the easiest one to write in there, as is the vertical shift. So I'm going to write that one next just so we get those two easier ones out of the way. If we're shifting down 5 units, that means I'm going to put minus 5 at the end here. That leaves me with my period and my phase shift. I'm always going to be calculating the period first. Notice that the period is 2 pi over B. We don't know what B is yet. We just know what the period is, but we don't know B. So we're going to find that first because once we do the phase shift, we need to use that value of B in our calculation. So if our period is 3 pi and the equation for the period is 2 pi over B. So I know that our period is 2 pi over B, and we know that our period is also equal to 3 pi. So from here, we can go ahead and solve for B. Solve in your favorite way. Sometimes once it's set up this way, you might be able to just look at it and know the answer, and that would be great. If you don't, then we'll solve this. I'm going to multiply by B, so it's going to say 3 pi times B equals 2 pi. And then to solve for B, I'm going to divide by 3 pi. And that's going to give me a B value of 2/3. So in my equation over here, I'm going to say that this is 2/3 times, you might have an x in there, you might have a theta in there, whatever you choose your variable to be, if they don't tell us what it needs to be. So 2/3 as my value of B. Now we're going to go ahead to our phase shift, which is negative C over B. They're telling us that our phase shift is pi. So if I sneak down here on the bottom, our phase shift is pi, and they're telling us that our phase shift is negative C over B, but we know that the B value now is 2/3. So just like we solved for B before, now we're going to solve for C. I'm going to do that by multiplying the 2/3 over to the other side. So 2/3 pi equals negative C, or in other words, C is equal to negative 2/3 pi. So we're going to put minus 2/3 pi right here. It doesn't always happen that those two numbers are the same. That's just a coincidence there for letter A. All right. At this point, what you can do is if you go to the next page in your 4.4 handout, there's going to be a little worksheet for you to do that's going to ask you to do the same steps that we just did. First, find the amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift of the function that's given to you. So go ahead and take a minute to try that. Pause this video, check out those questions, and then once you're done, you can come back to the video to see your answers. All right, here's the answers for each of those. So check those over. If you have any questions, let me know about each of those. Letter D for the phase shift is a little bit trickier for pi over 18. So make special note of how we're finding that answer. The next part of your worksheet, again, takes several minutes to complete. Number 2, if they're giving us the amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift, so the 4 items listed there, in order are telling you which things you have there. So A, here, this first term is your amplitude. The next one is your period. The next one is your phase shift. The next one is your vertical shift. So with the 4 items that are given there, now we want you to take a moment to write an equation for each of those. So again, pause the video and write an equation for A through D, then come back and check your answers. All right, and here we have our answers for letter A through D. Check those out and let me know if you have any questions.